Naveen, good to see you. Thank
Hello.
you for making a bit of time to come and have a chat with me. Appreciate that. I wanted to kick off the interview or our discussion really with something that you said to me when we spoke last, which I thought was quite horrifying actually. You said to me, online harm generates 178 billion, which I thought it's a terrible indictment. Now, I mean, just tell us about why that matters to you in particular.
Well, absolutely. I think there are a couple of things probably to put into context. Um, Childlight, which is a University of Edinburgh think tank, did some research in 2024, and they estimated that around 300 million children per year, and that's an increasing number,
Yeah.
are victims of online harm and sexual exploitation. And the organizations that benefit from that, so the sharing of explicit imagery of children, aged between 8 and 14, is a business.
Yeah.
And they estimate that that generates revenue of around 178 to $200 billion per
Which
year.
is it's awful. I mean, it's awful, but horrifying as well, isn't it?
It's
That's happening.
it's absolutely horrifying, and to think, I mean, if we just narrow that lens a little bit down into the UK, um, I think with the adoption of AI, so CSAM, so child sexual imagery, um, has increased by about 6,000%. So imagine that from 2023 to 2025, you've had over, I think it's 172,000 reported cases of online harm and sexual abuse. And the scary thing is that they're generally aged between 12 and 14.
Mm.
And I think the um, other sad fact is that young people, once they've been exposed, are now being financially exploited as well. So they are being held to ransom for the imagery that they're sharing with their predators. And that is then leading to, additional psychological harm and in
Just
some.
gets worse, doesn't it? It just keeps getting worse.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And AI mediated behavior now has changed the game. It's
Yeah.
accelerated the harm process, and it's made it a lot easier. Um, and if you think about some of the AIs that are out there at the moment, they are, they're responsible for some of this harm, that the acceleration of harm that we're
Yeah.
seeing.
Yeah. So, I mean, you're trying to do something about it, aren't you? I mean, tell us a bit about Secure Haven and how you're attempting to kind of tackle the issue. I mean, it's a pretty big issue to tackle, but I mean, let's hear about what your thinking is.
Yeah, absolutely. So Secure Haven kind of originated a couple of years ago when I was, just sitting down with my niece and, playing some games online. And she came across, one of the games, and there was some explicit imagery within the game. There was some adult content that was also in the game, and this actually had passed, the um, Apple download store, so it's an authentic, authentic game. It kind of sent me down a rabbit hole to try to understand, how that whole world exists for children. What exists out there in terms of parental control, and how do we manage access? And it really kind of drew to one conclusion: is that all of the risk that we manage, all of the harm that's captured, is done downstream. It's done after the fact, and in some cases, it's just not picked up at all. And I'm not saying that in any way that parental control tools are not worthwhile, 100% they are. They have a job to perform.
But they don't solve the whole problem, do they?
They solve part of the problem,
Yeah.
which is in its simplistic term, it's access control. You're restricting access to particular harmful websites. You're preventing children from accessing certain things online. Excuse me. And you're also, to a degree, I think iOS is coming out with an update this year where you won't be able to upload explicit images if you're a minor and you have a level of age restriction, but they're all downstream. So I wanted to kind of flip it on its head and say, well, what could we do to look at the upstream risk? So how do we start to manage and understand risk as it's forming, so that we can detect through a behavioral trajectory the behavior of the child and potentially the behavior of the predator, and highlight harm before it forms so that there's an intervention process, so parents can step in and take action before 3 months down the line and a 14-year-old girl is uploading an image of themselves, right?
And before we get into what you're doing, I mean, what's your background? How did you kind of come? I mean, how did you end up? I mean, I can imagine the motivation to wanting to address this problem, but I mean, how did you? I mean, do you have a technical background? I mean, how did you kind of come at this?
So I've spent probably around 30 years in cybersecurity,
Yeah.
uh, geopolitical risk, and behavioral risk. And one of my, and I spent a lot of time in industry, financial services, critical national infrastructure,
Yeah.
kind of intelligent adjacent environments. And one of the things that I've realized over time is there is tools and technology out there that do things for the corporate world.
Yeah.
But when I looked at what was happening in this space, you could use the same technology and tools, just invert it, and you could apply the same logic, to protecting children. We invest billions into understanding financial crime risk. We invest billions into protecting organizations from cybersecurity exposure, right? We invest billions in understanding geopolitical risk and doing kind of risk modeling. So it's no different.
So presumably, we're just not spending enough on protecting children. I mean, that's the short answer, isn't it?
And you're absolutely right. And I feel like there isn't the appetite to solve the problem, because it's a threefold problem. One is you want to protect the agency of the child itself, right? And make sure there is a level of privacy that the child can, feel comfortable with. You want parents to be well informed about what that exposure looks like. And you want the government to play a role in, pushing the right policies in order to, provide the mechanisms to, go after the organizations that are not actually applying the right level of control. And if you think about where we are in the UK, I mean, there was a lot of hype around, banning social media for, under 16-year-olds. But it is a downstream impact. It's exactly the same thing. You've just applied access control. You haven't looked at what's causing the behavioral harm in the first place. Which
And
is
so often, and so often, you need an individual that's willing to have a go at fixing the problem because they're not easy problems to fix, aren't they?
no,
No. So
it's a real challenge. Yeah.
yeah. So tell us about Secure Haven. I mean, you sort of touched on your thinking, which is about moving upstream. I mean, just give us a little bit more detail in how you are proposing to do that.
So instead of looking at events, so if you look at every existing tool that's out there in the marketplace, um, they kind of wait for something to happen. So in the context of cybersecurity, if we're talking about threat intelligence, where you've got a large scale, bank, for example, take a tier one commercial bank, HSBC, Lloyd's, or whatever,
Yeah.
um, and they want to gain an understanding of what threat exists out there, and what potential attack vectors they have. They'll build a very capable threat intelligence um, kind of environment. Within that, they'll wait for what we call indicators of compromise. They'll understand certain types of technical components that will cause certain threats. So it's learned behavior. It understands that basically, if it deviates from a particular baseline, then send an alert, and
Yeah.
this is the potential threat. Whereas with what we're trying to do in Secure Haven is not wait for the alert, is to say, actually, we can map the behavioral trajectory of an individual and a group and an environment just by using on-device inference. Basically means that there are a lot of signals that take place when you are interacting with a machine, and you're interacting with services, and you're interacting with applications, and we pull that metadata out to be able to then assess the behavioral trajectory of the individual.
And presumably this is using AI to do that at pace. Is that?
Yes, correct. Yeah. So we're using AI, which is on device inference. So there's a localized AI version. So it's sort of edge computing, if you want to look at it from that perspective. And because it's sitting on device, there isn't that consumption of AI tokens, right? It's a much more manageable thing. But what it does in essence, it could start to map the trajectory. So if you've got a 14-year-old that sits on YouTube for kids, and then is jumping to roadblocks, and then is jumping to online games. One of the barriers that we have, just generally in the world of technology now, is that majority of your communications are encrypted. Yeah. And online games now, especially platforms, whether it's Facebook or Instagram or whatever, once you get into a certain element of it, there's a level of encryption that kicks in. So a parent can't actually see what's happening once they go into those encrypted environments. So what this does is it enables that visibility without breaking the encryption process, but also without taking away agency from the child themselves. So we're not reading messages. We're not, breaching data privacy. Actually, privacy is one of the cornerstones of what we're trying to build in here. It's done by design, not by policy. Where we want to land is with very safe alerting for the parents, right? It's not to raise harm, not to raise an alarm that harm is taking place, but it's an observable behavior that it may relate to a specific harm category, like coercion or sexual exploitation or cyberbullying and things like that. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And so let's just go back to the situation. I mean, you talked about when you started. I mean, you decided that you were going to sort this problem out. So what happened then? I mean, just give us a sense of how because there's a lot to get off the ground here.
Yeah. Yeah. So my initial thought was, and it's a very interesting point, because looking at what's out in the marketplace was the biggest challenge, right? What tools and technology processes exist. 2 years ago, when AI was probably just about kicking off, right? In the right way. It was trying to understand the difference between probabilistic and deterministic behavior, and understanding kind of the behavioral science. And it's not a subject that I'd spend a lot of time on. So a lot of that was kind of researching the elements of behavioral science to understand what's been done already out in the world. And actually, I found quite a lot. And if you go towards more of the sort of intelligence fields, there is a lot of stuff like people that are the companies that already developed technology around wearables, that can pull, data about your heart rate and
Yeah,
your
yeah,
full
yeah.
health. There's stuff that's been developed within the real kind of intelligence community, from a military intelligence perspective that looks at, you know, um, very specific population data. There's a lot of stuff that takes place around insurance, also that maps human behavior and
So,
weather
so
patterns and
when
stuff
you, I
like
mean,
that.
how did people respond to you when you told them you were going to have a go at this? Because I mean, A, it's a big problem, and B, it's not on an obvious career path, is it? To say, oh, I'm suddenly going to try and fix this. I mean, how did people respond when you said you were going to invest what's a fairly significant amount of time and energy and money into trying to fix that problem? And how did other people respond? Do people
Um,
get it?
so I think people get it, and they understand the challenge, and I get a lot of, okay, that's really good, and well done for trying to solve the problem. What I found is, when it comes to investment, the one thing that really baffled me is not being able to raise money to get it funded. And that kind of shocked me a little bit. There seems to be this general view that safeguarding and venture capital dollars don't really mix. Um, and I've spent a year trying to raise capital for this particular project. Um, and the way that I packaged it as a safeguarding tool, the reality was that as soon as I mentioned the safeguarding element of it and not the enterprise element of it, the conversations kind of died. So,
That's funny, that isn't it?
yeah, and also, I've for the last year, I've been lobbying, the government, specifically the British government, and speaking with various ministers and speaking, with, safeguarding professionals, speaking with the Home Office, Department of
Mm.
Education, and again, a lot of, well done, we'll support you along the way, but there's this level of contradiction in we're really serious about, preventing online harm to children, yet you're not really investing in the right level of protection. You are still bowing towards, the large corporates that are actually geared up to provide that harm in a way, right? I mean, if you look at all of the major corporations that we have two problems actually. In the UK, none of them are owned by UK companies; they're all
Yeah.
US based, right? So we have a data sovereignty problem as it exists, right? Just generally, we're beholden to US tech. And then the second thing is that the Online Safety Act is geared to self assurance. So you're relying on these organizations to self-assess, the kind of risk that they pose,
Yeah.
and it's still very weak. So policy around it is very weak, and the appetite to change it within government is very weak. I mean, we've had, two revolving, ministers for online harm and safety for women and girls in the last year, right? One that was appointed after the other one left resigned, just a couple of weeks ago. So there's just no continuity in the way that government is forming an opinion.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a really difficult thing to get funded. So in order to get it funded, my premise hasn't changed, but I've had to pivot and create an enterprise version of the same tool so that I can get it funded. And one of the things I kind of realized along this journey was actually maybe profiting from the fear that parents feel about their children being online is probably not the right thing. So to build an enterprise version of this that can be applied to, corporate behavioral intelligence, and then solve the online harm issue as a freemium, 100% free for people to consume. And it's the only way I think we're going to get it to market.
Yeah, which is kind of a bit disappointing, really, isn't it? I mean, because there's a lot of talk about ending violence against women and reducing harm to young people. As ever with governments, not necessarily that much action, which is pretty disappointing. Um, you have, having said that, you've done a lot of the heavy lifting. I mean, how do you see the next bit? I'm conscious you still got the fundraising stuff to do. And how do you see the next bit of the journey going forward?
So, we've built a workable model. We have an MVP. We're doing
Mm.
quite a lot of, conversations like this
Yeah,
to raise awareness. You know, my view is just to keep banging the drum, right?
right.
I think that that's the easiest thing to say, but it is just about raising awareness and partnering with the right people that want to make change. And there are a lot of organizations out there that are keen to make both sort of political policy changes and also, technology changes as well. And I think it's going to take someone or something quite bold. And we had this saying in sort of cybersecurity as well, especially in the corporate world. You wait for something catastrophic to happen before someone takes action, and it's such
Yeah.
a sad thing, right? That um, we will probably find ourselves in a position where something actually horrific happens to a child, and
Yeah.
then the government will kind of take notice. But I think the scary thing is there was a report that was issued by the Home Office in 2023. They estimate that the lifetime harm to children in the UK is £10 billion.
Mm.
So the UK government spend £10 billion on aftercare, basically, right? Um, so think about if that money was invested in tools, processes, technology, and shifting, that kind of risk all upstream, so you could have intervention rather than detection. It would be a step in the right direction.
Yeah, I
So
mean, it's interesting you make that point. I mean, what was going through my mind as we were talking is the debate about the NHS. I mean, there's been a debate about the government. I mean, at least the previous government, the Starmer government. I don't know about the current one, but there was, they wanted to shift from, helping people that were ill to preventing people getting ill, which seems to me a very sensible shift to make. I mean, not an easy shift to make, but a very sensible shift to make. And it seems to me it's the same issue here, isn't it? I mean, they should be thinking about how do we prevent these problems rather than spending a boatload of money mopping up the problem afterwards. But so like I said, it's rather, I mean, rather disappointing that policymakers aren't a bit quicker on their feet around that, really.
well, I mean, I sat in a room with senior policy advisors from the Home Office, and what was really interesting about that conversation was, um, and I think it's just a little bit of lip service. It's just okay, that's really interesting. Wow, congratulations and good luck on your journey. And it wasn't okay. How can we adapt this and kind of make a change and look at policy in the right way? And I think it's not just about the UK as well. I mean, every government in the world has the same
Yeah,
issue.
yeah,
And if you look at the kind of global picture, I mean, it's a global marketplace, as we kind of indicated in the beginning. You look at that global picture. Why is there not a consolidated view that this all needs to change? I even reached out to the United Nations. They've got a couple of projects that they're trying to solve, but it feels like it's a very insular, isolated, very country specific issue. And it's not being really addressed at a global level. So Starlight is probably the first that's looked at it at a global perspective. So the data is still being gathered. And just imagine that's just the reported cases. It's, think about
it's the tip
the
of the
number of,
iceberg, isn't it, really?
yeah, and the
Yeah.
unreported.
And let me ask you about, your experience of being the CEO of trying to build this business. I mean, let's start at the beginning, I suppose. I mean, why did you want to become a CEO? I mean, why did you want to do that? Because I mean, it's one of those jobs where it's a bit of a roller coaster. There's good days and there's bad days. It's a never-ending to-do list. I mean, my experience was that it's trying to avoid being knocked over by somebody was a lot of the. I mean, why did you want to be a CEO? I mean, why do you want to build a business in this space?
It's a really good question. I think the honest answer is I don't really want to be a CEO, but um, I think I've kind of reached that point in my career where if I can't find something that can solve a problem, I want to solve it myself.
Right. Okay.
Um, and I understand, this is not the first business I've built. I've run an advisory and consultancy business, but it's a very different kettle of fish.
Yeah, to build
Uh,
the product. Yeah.
and kind of entering something that stems in kind of four different worlds. You've got kind of the intelligence, the behavioral science, the psychology, the technical bits. For me, it was, the learning, just being able to learn something new, number one. And kind of number two, it was um, I could build something with the ethical constraint that I wanted it to be built. So it could exist without me moving forward. And even if I couldn't make it a successful business, whatever I built, I could put it into a public domain and someone else could help build it. So,
Mm.
there's that as well, right? So yeah, it's definitely a challenge, kind of running a business and keeping the lights on
Because you're
and
kind of swimming. I mean, it's one of those businesses that you're kind of, I mean, to coin that phrase, somebody says, you're kind of swimming against the tide
yeah.
in this area, isn't it? Which requires quite a lot of commitment. I mean, where did your commitment come from for this? Because I get the sense it's not just about building a business here. This is more about something else. I mean,
Um, I think it's probably more, personal. I've had an interesting life, I would say. I kind of grew up in the Middle East when I was younger. I've experienced what it feels like to be in a war zone and exposed to war, being in refugee camps. I never went to university. I don't have a degree. Um, I found cybersecurity when I was very, very young. So there's a level of determination there. And I ended up working in large corporates when I was like 21. My first ever job in cybersecurity was with Deutsche Bank, and then I got that taste. But it's very personal to me. I feel very personal about my profession, and wanting to um, kind of provide that level of protection, I suppose. I think it's really important. And it comes from a very deep place about, the things that I've seen and witnessed um, and yeah, it's really about, leaving the next generation with something useful,
mm.
you know. I'm not doing it for profit. If I wanted to be profitable, I'd do something else, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So
You
often
know,
you hear that from entrepreneurs. People always think it's about money, and usually it's not. I mean, but it's what's also interesting is what you're saying is that this is really tied to your identity as a professional that is whose business is about protecting people.
correct.
You're tying it to your identity rather than anything else. I mean, is that fair?
Yeah, I would say so. I feel very deeply about certain things, and especially when it comes to harm in general. And from my own personal experience, I've experienced, harm and coercive relationships, and bad situations, and one of the realizations is, when you go through something like that, and especially with someone with my level of experience, can actually get entwined into that. I think about those that don't have my level of experience and understanding of that world, and are getting trapped in that space. And when I look at harm in general, I mean, what we're developing is directed at children, but it also applies to adults and
Yeah.
coercive behavior in enterprise,
Yeah.
right? Um, so yeah, I think I've taken everything that I've learned and landed at this point in time where I want to turn it into something useful rather than sit on, the trauma of the past. And, you deal with it in your own way, but actually channeling it into something that's useful, I think is really important.
Let me ask you another question about the identity piece, because one of the other things I think is a challenge for entrepreneurs is separating, if you like, their own identity from the identity of the business. I mean, in terms of the businesses I've had, I mean, they've been very much part of me. What you're talking about is having a very strong identity built around protecting people and a business that is trying to protect people. I mean, how do you separate those things, would you say?
That's a really good question. I think I've set myself pretty good boundaries, not to
Right.
contaminate one versus the other, right? There's an element of my, I say, personal identity that filters in and drives what I'm trying to build, but it doesn't kind of define it, right? There is a good, healthy separation because, I've taken time to, um, understand myself. I've taken time to understand what I'm trying to build and what the vision of that is, right? So yeah, I think I've reached a pretty healthy separation point between the two. I think one does influence the other, right?
Yeah.
Without a doubt. And like you said, there are days where it's really complicated and you can't distill between the other, and but it is just by taking a breath and say, hey,
Yeah,
it's
I mean
okay.
the thing for me is that when you're having a really tough time, it becomes very personal, doesn't it? Because if your identity is tied to the identity of the business, if the business is having a hard time, I mean it's tough for you. I mean
Correct.
it can be quite difficult to separate those things, I think, which is tough on people's mental health.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think, when I was going through the sort of the fundraising process, and you go through that rejection phase,
Yeah,
that feels very personal because you feel like they're rejecting you, directly and rejecting your ideas. And actually, um, no one has rejected the idea, no one has rejected the premise, but they've rejected some of the investability because it's safeguarding. So you do feel it. You feel that strain, and it can take a bit of a knock on your mental health. Takes a little time to recover, but yeah, it's part and parcel of being an entrepreneur, I think.
yeah. Yeah, I mean I mean people don't understand, I don't think, how difficult building a business can be at an emotional level. I mean, there's all the practical stuff and knowing what to do and what have you, but at an emotional level, it's very different to being an employee. And I don't think people, well, certainly unless you've built a business, I mean, I just don't think people get the degree to which it's an emotional experience, I
Yeah,
think. Let me ask you about something a bit more practical, though. I mean, one of the challenges is to work out what to do and what not to do. I mean, and there is a lot of noise out in the market, isn't there? I mean, I constantly find myself being distracted by stuff, and then I realise wasted time on something that was just, it's kind of shiny object syndrome. Looked interesting, probably wasn't relevant, but occupied me for an hour or two, but it shouldn't have done. I mean, how do you sort of find your way through the noise? I mean, what's your take on that? Because this cyber world and data protection and privacy and young people protecting young people. I mean, there's a lot to be distracted by in that little world, isn't there?
yeah, you're kind of absolutely right. I think there is a vast amount of noise. I mean, cybersecurity as a whole is a huge discipline, right? And through my years, I've specialized in one or two areas, right? But you're never going to know uh,
No.
everything. Um, but I think with what I was trying to create is a category rather than
Right.
a
Okay.
single kind of
And why do you, I mean, that's a very interesting point. I mean, why do you say that?
because the behavioral risk intelligence as a whole, behavioral risk, isn't something that's measured. It's only a very recent kind of measurement. Gallup did a poll, I think, last year, where they estimate that behavioral failure in enterprise causes around $10 trillion worth of loss a year.
So that's people doing stupid things.
Yep. And because behavioral trajectory isn't something that organizations map, whereas I think that everything starts with behavior, all risk starts with behavior.
Yeah.
Um, um, you know, decision making, risk suppression. If you think about all the way that organizations gain information about where their risks are, audit reports and external audit reports and, penetration testing and all the kind of stuff that you would, do from a compliance point of view. It gives them a point in time reference of what their control failure is or exposure is, but it never tells them how those decisions were made. It doesn't tell them the behavior that led up to those decisions, right? And I find that a lot of failure in business is by people, not by technology. The breaches happen because people fail to listen.
Yeah.
And if you can't map that behavior within an organization, then the organization fails. So it's about, going back to the question, how do you get rid of the noise? I've stopped looking at things that are all about technology alone. I've stopped looking at the kind of antiquated way in which we look at cybersecurity risk, which is very control focused, and start looking at the other side of the equation is, okay, let's ask an intelligent question. Is the behavioral trajectory going to have an impact on operational financial positioning of the firm? And if we can't translate that into something that's tangible for an executive to understand, then, if you take a technical report and say, hey, you've got all of this risk, they're just going to look at you and go, what are you talking about? How do you translate that into something they can understand, right? And generally, it's easier to talk about behavior with an executive team. I was doing some work for a FTSE 250 company, some consulting work for a FTSE 250 company recently, and every failure point was about behavior. It had nothing to do with tools and technology. They were heavily invested in tools and technology and process and everything, but their failure was the people, and they couldn't see it because they were existing in their own little silos and operating in that way. Every single report that went up to the senior leadership was green. It was, yeah, we're doing fine, behavior is good, everything's great, but it just wasn't true. And I think a lot of organizations are like that.
Yeah, no, I think that final point is well made. I mean, a lot of organisations like that, no doubt about that. I mean, I talk to CEOs all the time, and when you start asking about those sorts of things, I mean, it's just not on their radar. A lot of the time.
And they're quite oblivious to it, right? People tend to think that very oddly that there's a cohesive relationship between a C-suite. There isn't. That there is, especially in listed companies where it's very political, and each C-suite member has a little fiefdom of their own that they need to manage, right? Because somebody in that C-suite is etching for the top job, right? Yeah. So there isn't that cohesiveness, and so you have to treat each of those behaviors that each of those individuals have that will trickle down to how they're going to run their function.
Yeah.
And that's where the harm starts. That's where
I also think that they diagnose the problem in the wrong way. I mean, I think people think about cybersecurity as a kind of technical problem, but the truth of the matter is, it's as you pointed out, there's a lot of the risk is around behaviour. But the bigger issue is that if a company does get hit, it then becomes about a reputation and evaluation problem a lot of companies that get attacked end up going, they get, I mean, was it 60 or 70% go under in 6 months from a big attack? I mean, people don't think about it in that way, so they don't, because they don't think about it in that way, in my view, not that I know that much about these things, but they don't necessarily prepare as well as they could do for those sort of eventualities. Anyway, I mean, we could probably talk about that a lot, but let me ask you a couple of other questions to do with decision making. So one of the things that I think is interesting is how CEOs approach the process of making decisions. I mean, we've just talked about how people get it wrong.
Yeah.
In your take on this, I mean, how do you balance the kind of evidence piece with the gut piece, the kind of the intuitive, I think we need to do this, with how do we know what the evidence is telling us? I mean, how do you balance that? How do you feel about that component of the way you make decisions about the business?
It's a really good question. I'm quite analytical. So and I see things in I'm very pattern recognition focused, right? So and I think applying my intelligence kind of lens on everything that I do is helpful because it allows me to apply my experience to a particular problem
Yeah.
and then go down that path. So I'm probably 50-50 to start with, go with my gut, look at the evidence, and then that slowly it will arbitrate depending on
Mm.
where I'm landing. But generally, I will go with my gut because I can put myself in the position of being able to relate to the kind of problem I'm trying to solve, and then pull in the evidence when I need it if I'm unsure about where I need to go. But I do make very quick decisions. I mean, it is, especially with developing the kind of tool I'm trying to develop. I don't have the luxury of time because technology is not going to wait for me, right? There's a speed in which we need to do things now that didn't exist 10 years ago.
I mean, I was about to say, I mean, my view is that the pace of change is just getting faster. I mean, it's certainly a lot faster than when I started in business. Okay, that's 50 odd years ago or something, but it's a lot faster and getting faster.
Yeah, and also getting riskier, right?
Yeah.
We're creating tools and technology that is outpacing our ability to control it, number one. And number two, I think we're at this point where the knowledge it takes to build certain things is going to diminish over time,
Mm.
right? I mean, I'm not a coder, but there's so much tool.
Yeah,
There's
so much
so
you could
much
do.
that you
Yeah.
could do. There's
Yeah.
so much you could do now, right?
Yeah.
Um, um, and so I think that AI has helped us in a way, but unless you measure it correctly, it can be detrimental. So I think it's
Yeah.
yeah, I think you're right to say decision making has changed. It's significantly changed in the way that we have to think about tools and technology processes for
And what
sure.
would you say when you look back? What would you say that you've learned about decision making? Would you say you're a better decision maker now? I mean, than
Yeah, I'm definitely less emotional about my decisions.
right. And what's brought that about?
I just think a little bit of time away from the corporate world has made me
Right.
realize
Okay. Yeah.
um, I'm definitely less emotional about my decisions because I used to take everything very personally, when I was working in
Right.
industry. Not in the wrong way, but just actually I used to feel like, well, why hire someone like me to come and work in your organization if you're not going to take my advice, right? I could never
Yeah.
understand it. Why pay someone six plus figure salaries to come and help protect your organization, but yet when we give you the advice, you're just
Yeah.
not
I mean,
willing.
there's an interesting thing there about being an entrepreneur, I think, and that is the learning as an entrepreneur is not theoretical in the way that you listen to lectures and write essays. It's not, it's very much learning by doing. And what I mean by that is that you have to deal with the consequences of your
Yeah,
decisions, both good and bad. I mean, you make a decision, if it goes well, okay, if it goes badly, okay. Either way, you have to deal with it.
yeah,
Which means that I think the learning experience is much more powerful because you can't say, oh, somebody else made that decision.
yeah,
You have to ultimately, as the CEO, you're responsible for getting those things right. And if you don't get it right, you're also responsible. I mean, how
yeah.
does that, I mean, has that been part of the reason that you would say you're a better decision maker?
Yeah, and you own all the risk, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Ultimately, yeah. And it's happened to me. I've gone down rabbit holes where I've spent, days learning a particular element of behavioral science and try to adopt it into my thinking. and I probably lost a month, doing it,
Yeah.
doing a bit of coding that went down that route, so I understand it, fully. And then you sit there and think, right, okay, great exercise, but what a waste of money, time, and effort.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
now you're off track from,
Yeah.
where you need to be. And it's really about pulling yourself in. So now I'm a bit more constrained, like I'm
Yeah.
right. I have a plan, and I need to execute that plan. And if I have any room left over afterwards, then I'll go and
Yeah.
experiment
Yeah.
with
I
other
have a
things.
I have a post-it note up on the wall saying, "Do less, but do it better." Because I get so I mean I get interested in things, which has always been my problem. Never practice.
I will jump down a rabbit hole in a heartbeat because I
Yeah.
like the investigation process of
Yeah.
doing something. Yeah.
Let me ask you about something else that I think changes in businesses as an entrepreneur, and that's the way you lead people. I mean, has the way you lead people changed, would you say? Has that been impacted by what you're doing, the environment that you're in?
Yeah, I think so. I think corporate leadership is very, very different to entrepreneurial leadership,
Yeah,
right? Uh, I think within corporate leadership, you're bound by other people's rules, not your own.
yeah,
Um, uh, so I think I've definitely become a lot more collaborative in the way that I think. I'm open to bigger and better ideas. I've realized that, hey, I'm not good at certain things. Definitely not good at certain things, and I should stay away from them, and I should not do them. And I need to surround myself with people that have the skill and capability that excel mine in those areas, that can effectively challenge what I'm doing. Um, because I might have the idea, but I don't know how to execute it. And I need that execution specialist to come in and say, hey, this is the way you do it. And I've got to be able to trust in that as well. And I think that was probably part and parcel of the hardest bit, is letting go of
Mhm.
that sort of ability to control every aspect of what you're trying to build. At a certain point, you have to say, right, I've taken it as far as I can in here. I need an expert to come in and do the rest. And I think, yeah, I've definitely learned um, that about myself, is to, yeah, provide effective challenge, but listen more.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah. And what would you say you've learned from the successes that you've had? I mean, you've had a few interesting things happen along the way, which I would think, I mean, I would describe as successes. I mean, what would you say you've learned from those successes?
um, to walk and not run. I think when I was younger, I was so gun ho
Right.
and so well, if I'm right, you're wrong, and it was very black and white, and it was very arrogant. And I look back on that time in my life and I think, okay, if only I'd listened more, and if only I'd slowed down, and if I'd taken a slightly different approach. And I think, yes, very successful in my career, and it's just learning from, what got me there to where I need to get to next, right? And I think there's failure in that as well, right?
I mean,
Which
I was just about to ask about that. I mean, what have you learned from failures? I mean, what sort of failures have you had and what have they taught you?
I mean, if I look at what I started with Secure Haven, and I don't know whether I call it a failure, but a pivot maybe, is really trying to push on child safety, but then realizing it's not an investable process, right? I think that really hit home. Um,
But you can only, that's an interesting point there, because you can only learn that by doing it. I mean, I don't know
correct.
whether somebody said to you at the beginning, that's not investable.
No,
But in one sense, you have to go out and stand up in front of a bunch of investors and have them tell you that they're not going to invest to learn that, don't you?
I mean, I sat down, with a lot of very technical people at the beginning of this process, right? I mean, tier one organizations from Google and Microsoft, and really people I trust, that have better breadth of knowledge than I do in certain spaces, and not once did they push back on the thesis or the premise, right? So that gives you the confidence to say, yeah, okay, oh, great, I can go do it. And you're right, the realization is that once you get into a room and you're with these very cutthroat individuals, that look at what their fund is going to return, and they don't really care about your business. Yeah, let's be honest, right? They're not really that interested. They just want to know if it's going to turn a profit, and their exit is going to be a unicorn. And if that's great, then hey, we'll invest, right? It's such a learning curve, and um, um, so yeah, I felt like a failure, but it's much more of a pivot, and I actually think when I was younger, um, I tried to build a very similar, not similar thing, but I tried to build something about 10 years ago. And even that then, was way ahead of its time. It wasn't right. It was looking at all of the fractional kind of services model. Um, and and so you realize, again, going to market and understanding that you as a solopreneur or an entrepreneur, you don't have the name, you don't have the credibility. All of your past experience is actually irrelevant.
Yeah.
Right. You can't compete with people in the market space, unless someone takes notice. And it brings me on to this point about accessibility. If you can't, you don't have the visibility with the right individuals that are going to say, hey, actually, I really like your idea. I'm going to invest and it's going to go somewhere. So I think the ecosystem is broken, as a whole. And I think that's another kind of failure point as well, is trying to attract venture. You feel like you're failing because no one is responding to your project, and that's, yeah.
I mean, certainly, my experience was that funding rounds, they build your resilience,
Yeah.
to put it politely. So a couple of final questions before we wind up. I mean,
Yeah.
what would you say then, given what you've just said, what would you say is the key to being a successful CEO?
Oh, um, I think there are probably a couple of things. I can only speak for myself, right? Nobody
Yeah.
else. I think you have to have a very clear view of what your end state is. What is where do you want to land, and within that, who you want to surround yourself with. Yeah. Whether that's personal advisors or friends and family, that are going to keep you grounded, um, um, and protect that part of your life in the right way. But also your professional network, right? Who's your professional support network, and you need it. Yeah, right. The one thing that I've definitely learned that's gonna kind of make me successful, and I think I touched on it before, which was just listening a lot more, and taking time to make the right structural decisions for your business. Yeah, there are operational decisions you're going to have to make every day. Yeah, about X and Y. But I also think, for me, what I'm trying to build is sits on a very ethical boundary. It's not about surveillance. It's about protection. It's about intervention. Right? And I don't want that to change. And therefore, I'm not going to sort of sacrifice certain things in order to get funded. This is what it is. I'm
You need to find an investor that buys into that, don't you?
absolutely,
But it's a big haystack to search through, isn't it?
yeah, and you know what? I'll keep going until I can't, right? And then that's the philosophy. Yeah.
Yeah, perseverance. It was some famous American president who said perseverance is everything, and I think he's onto something about that.
Yeah, yeah,
One last question before we
yeah.
wind up. Is there any piece of I mean, if you were to speak to a rookie CEO, somebody just starting out, wanting to build a business, what would your advice to them be?
Um, be 100% sure that's what you want to do.
Okay,
Um,
good
be
advice that.
be 100% sure that's what you want to do, and make sure that you have a passion for what it is you're trying to solve. Because if you don't have the passion and you're doing it solely to generate revenue, right? So you're doing it because you think you're going to get. I think we live in an insta world, right, where everyone thinks they're, going to exit on 80, $100 million by building no code, stuff, right? It's just not true. Um, uh, there's some wild stories out there of individuals that have done that, yeah. But think about the engineering capability that individual had in order to get to that point, yeah. But
Oh,
be a
those things are
hundred
mythical. A lot of those stories are
yeah, I
made
just
up.
don't believe a lot of them. But anyway, but my point is just if you're passionate about something and you feel that what you're building is going to change something, do some good. I think, help a business, help an individual. Yeah, do it. But be sure about it. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
not
it's
for
the
the
thing that
sake.
being sure about it, being passionate about it is the thing that will sustain you through all the setbacks, I think is probably how I'd see that. Naveen, thank you I mean, a great piece of advice to end on. Thank you for taking a bit of time to come and talk us through what you're doing. Good luck going forward. I mean, it's a very important area that you're working on, and I hope for not just for your sake, but I hope for other people's sake, you make progress with it, and it's a success. So like I said, thanks for coming on, and good luck going forward.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
All right, see you soon. Bye bye.
Yeah, cheers, bye.